My mother-in-law's toast was a 15-minute list of my failures. I had the mic next. The microphone feedback screeched through the reception hall as Patricia, my brand new mother-in-law, cleared her throat for the third time. 150 guests had already endured 12 minutes of what she called a toast, but what I recognized as a public execution disguised as wedding well wishes. And then there was the time Sarah decided to surprise us all by cooking Thanksgiving dinner in 2019, Patricia continued, her voice dripping with fake sweetness as she adjusted her champagne-colored dress. Well, let's just say the fire department was very understanding about smoke damage. Scattered uncomfortable laughter rippled through the crowd. My face burned hotter than that turkey had 3 years ago. Beside me, my new husband David squeezed my hand under the white tablecloth, but I could feel his tension radiating through his palm. Of course, we've all learned to manage our expectations over the years, Patricia went on, consulting the actual handwritten notes she'd brought to the podium. Handwritten notes. For a toast. At my wedding. Like when Sarah told us she was going to law school, that was quite the adventure, wasn't it? 3 different schools, 2 dropped majors, and 1 very expensive piece of paper that's been gathering dust for, oh, how long now, dear? 4 years? I watched my college roommate Jessica shift uncomfortably at table 7. My own mother sat frozen at the head table, her knuckles white around her wine glass. She'd flown in from Oregon specifically for this day, spent her entire savings on her dress and the flowers for my bouquet. But we mustn't dwell on career struggles, Patricia continued with a smile that could cut glass. Sarah has so many other, unique qualities. Like her decorating sense. David's apartment went through quite the transformation when she moved in. I'll never forget walking into that explosion of color and wondering if a craft store had actually exploded. The coordinator, Maria, kept glancing at me from beside the DJ booth, clearly wondering if she should intervene. We'd specifically discussed keeping speeches to 5 minutes maximum. I'd even put it in writing on the timeline I'd emailed to all the speakers 2 weeks ago. And let's not forget the budgeting skills, Patricia's voice grew louder, more confident as she warmed to her theme. David, honey, you remember when Sarah insisted you two could afford that vacation to Italy? The one that maxed out both your credit cards and had you eating ramen for 6 months? But the Instagram photos were lovely, weren't they? Though I noticed the posts about the debt didn't get quite as many likes. My throat felt like sandpaper. David's jaw was clenched so tight I worried about his dental work. His sister Jennifer sat at table 4, staring down at her salmon like it contained the secrets of the universe. Even Patricia's own husband, David's father, was studying his watch with intense fascination. But today is about new beginnings, Patricia announced, finally seeming to wind down. About learning from our mistakes and growing into the people we're meant to become. Sarah, I hope marriage will help you develop some of those life skills that seem to, well, let's call them fashionably late to arrive. She raised her champagne flute with a flourish. To David and Sarah. May your marriage be everything you make it. The polite applause that followed felt like pity. Patricia handed the microphone to Maria with a satisfied smile, then sat down beside her husband, smoothing her dress like she'd just delivered the Gettysburg Address. Maria approached our table, microphone extended toward me. Sarah? Would you like to share some words? Every eye in the room fixed on me. The microphone felt impossibly heavy in my trembling hands. I stood slowly, my beaded wedding dress catching the light from the crystal chandeliers David and I had specifically chosen because they reminded me of the ones in my grandmother's dining room, the grandmother who'd raised me after my father left, the one Patricia had dismissed as simple folk when she'd still been alive to defend herself. Thank you, Patricia, I said, my voice barely steady. That was comprehensive. A few people shifted in their seats. I caught sight of my boss, Jennifer Martinez, at table 9. She'd given me the afternoon off and driven 2 hours to be here. Last month, she'd told me I was being considered for senior associate, something I hadn't even told David yet because I wanted to be sure first. Apparently, my law degree wasn't gathering quite as much dust as Patricia believed. You know, I've been thinking about family a lot lately, I continued, finding my voice growing stronger. About what it means to build someone up versus tear them down. David's eyes widened slightly. He knew that tone. I'd used it exactly once before, the night he'd suggested maybe I should try to understand his mother's helpful suggestions about my career choices. Patricia mentioned our Italy trip from 2 years ago. She's absolutely right, we did max out our credit cards. What she didn't mention is that we did it because David's grandfather, her own father, was dying, and his last wish was to see the vineyard in Tuscany where he'd proposed to David's grandmother in 1952. I looked directly at Patricia. Her champagne flute had frozen halfway to her lips. We spent 6 months eating ramen because David wanted to scatter his grandfather's ashes in that exact spot, and we couldn't afford both the plane tickets and the $1,000 a night hotel Patricia had recommended. So we stayed in hostels and ate street food and hitchhiked between cities, but we got there. And David got to say goodbye. The silence in the room had shifted. People were actually listening now, not just enduring. Patricia also mentioned my career struggles. 3 schools, she said. She's right again. I started at Stanford Law, full scholarship, but I couldn't handle being 3,000 miles away when my grandmother was going through chemo. So I transferred to Portland State to be closer to home. Then I transferred again to night school here in Chicago when grandma needed full-time care and I was working 2 jobs to pay for her medications that insurance wouldn't cover. My voice caught slightly. I graduated summa cum laude at 32, which made me the oldest person in my class and apparently a late bloomer. But I was also the only person who'd written their thesis on elder care law while actually providing elder care. That thesis got me my job at Hendricks & Associates, where I've been working for 4 years building a practice helping families navigate exactly the kind of medical and financial nightmares we went through. I paused, letting that sink in. At table 12, David's uncle Robert, Patricia's own brother, was nodding slowly. His wife had died of Alzheimer's 3 years ago. And yes, Patricia, I did redecorate David's apartment when I moved in. I painted over those beige walls and added what you called an explosion of color. David's therapist actually calls it creating a warm, nurturing environment. See, David's been dealing with anxiety and depression since his grandfather died, something we probably should have addressed instead of pretending everything was fine. David's hand found mine again, squeezing tight. This time, his grip felt like support, not restraint. The decorating criticism is particularly interesting coming from someone who told me, at our engagement party, in front of my future husband, that David would eventually grow tired of living in a kindergarten classroom. I let my gaze sweep across the room, landing on several family members who'd been present that night. What David actually told me, later that evening while he was crying in our kindergarten classroom, was that it was the first time his apartment had ever felt like home instead of a museum. Patricia's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied foundation. She was gripping her napkin so tightly her manicured nails were leaving marks in the fabric. But I think my favorite part of Patricia's toast was the Thanksgiving story. The fire department was indeed very understanding about the smoke damage. They were also very understanding about why I was so distracted that I forgot about the turkey in the oven. I turned to look directly at her again. Because I was locked in the bathroom, sobbing, after Patricia told me, and I quote, that she supposed she'd have to get used to disappointing holidays now that David had chosen someone so far beneath his standards. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. At the head table, David's father William had gone completely rigid, staring at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. The turkey caught fire because I was having a panic attack in the bathroom while Patricia explained to my own mother, in my own kitchen, how I'd never be the kind of wife the family needed. My voice was steady now, clear and carrying. My mother, who worked 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school as a single parent, who raised me to believe I could accomplish anything, sat there and listened to a woman who's never worked a day in her life explain why her daughter wasn't good enough. I glanced at my mother, who had tears streaming down her face. But for the first time in 3 years, she was looking at me with pride instead of the worried disappointment I'd grown accustomed to seeing. The truly beautiful thing about tonight, Patricia, is that you've given me something I've been wanting for 3 years, witnesses. I gestured to the room full of David's extended family, many of whom were staring at Patricia like they were seeing her for the first time. Because this isn't new behavior. This is just the first time you've done it in front of people who matter to David. Uncle Robert was leaning forward now, his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked like recognition. At table 6, David's cousin Michelle, Patricia's own niece, had her phone out and was clearly recording. David's therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen at Northwestern Medical, excellent credentials. Patricia, Stanford trained like you always insist is so important. She's been helping us understand why David developed panic attacks every time we visited. Why he started making excuses to skip family dinners. Why he asked me, 6 months ago, if I thought we could have a small courthouse wedding instead of this reception. David's grip on my hand tightened, but when I looked at him, he nodded almost imperceptibly. I was the one who insisted on this party. I thought if Patricia could just see how happy David and I make each other, she might finally accept me. I thought if I planned the perfect wedding, chose the right flowers, the right menu, wore the right dress, maybe she'd realize I'm not the enemy. I looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of people who'd known David his whole life, who'd watched him become smaller and quieter at every family gathering for the past 3 years. I was wrong. But tonight, you've all seen exactly who we're dealing with. I set the microphone down on the table with deliberate care, my hands finally steady. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then Patricia shot to her feet like she'd been launched from a catapult. How dare you, she hissed, her champagne-colored dress rustling as she grabbed for the microphone. After everything we've done for you, after we welcomed you into this family. Sit down, Patricia. The voice came from behind me. David's father William stood slowly, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow across our table. In 31 years of marriage, I'd never heard him speak to his wife with anything other than gentle deference. The entire room seemed to lean forward collectively. William, she's lying, Patricia began, but he held up one weathered hand. About which part? His voice carried across the silent room. About what you said at Thanksgiving? Because I was there, Patricia. I heard you. He looked around the reception hall, his gaze landing on faces I now realized had been carefully neutral at family gatherings for years. How many of you have heard my wife's helpful observations about Sarah? At table 4, David's cousin Jennifer raised her hand slowly. Then Uncle Robert. Then David's Aunt Catherine, Patricia's own sister-in-law. One by one, hands went up around the room. 12. 15. 20 people. Patricia's face cycled through expressions like a broken slot machine, shock, rage, confusion, then something that looked almost like fear. They're all, this is, David, tell them. Tell them how dramatic Sarah gets, how she twists everything. Mom. David stood up beside me, his voice quieter than his father's but somehow more devastating. I asked you. 3 times, I asked you to be kind to her. I told you she'd lost her grandmother, that she was struggling, that she needed support. His voice cracked slightly. You looked me in the eye and promised you'd try harder. I was trying to help you see. See what? David's voice rose, and several people at the back tables craned their necks to hear better. See that the woman who held my head while I threw up from anxiety medication wasn't good enough? See that someone who worked 60-hour weeks to pay for her dying grandmother's care was irresponsible with money? Patricia opened her mouth, but no words came. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she seemed genuinely speechless. That's when Michelle, Patricia's niece at table 6, stood up with her phone still recording. Aunt Patricia, I've got about 20 minutes of footage from tonight. Including the part where you called Sarah that gold-digging waitress during cocktail hour. She looked around the room apologetically. I was making a wedding video. I didn't realize. Jesus Christ, Michelle, stop recording, Patricia snapped, lunging toward her niece's table. Actually, Michelle said, taking a step back, I think I'll keep going. This is fascinating family history. The wedding coordinator, Maria, finally approached our table with the expression of someone who'd seen every possible reception disaster but was encountering something entirely new. Perhaps we should. No. The voice came from table 12, where David's grandmother Eleanor sat in her wheelchair, oxygen tank beside her. At 94, she rarely spoke at family gatherings anymore, but her voice carried the authority of decades. Let them finish. Patricia whirled toward her mother-in-law. Mother Eleanor, you don't understand what's happening here. I understand perfectly. Eleanor's cloudy blue eyes fixed on Patricia with laser precision. I've been watching you torture that girl for 3 years, and I've been a coward for not stopping it. She gestured weakly toward me. Sarah, dear, come here. I walked over to her table, acutely aware that every person in the room was watching. Eleanor reached up with a trembling hand and patted my cheek. Your grandmother would be proud, she whispered, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. And Patricia? She turned toward her daughter-in-law. You're no longer welcome in my home. The champagne flute slipped from Patricia's fingers and shattered against the marble floor. The sound of breaking glass seemed to snap something loose in the room. Patricia stood frozen, staring down at the champagne and crystal scattered across the floor, her chest rising and falling like she'd just run a marathon. Mother Eleanor, you can't possibly mean, she started, but David's grandmother had already turned her wheelchair away, dismissing her completely. That's when David's father William pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what looked like text messages. Sarah, he said, his voice carrying that same unfamiliar authority, Patricia told us you'd been asking David for money. Said you'd run up credit card debt and expected him to bail you out. He held up his screen. I've got 6 months of messages here where she's cataloging your supposed financial irresponsibility. My stomach dropped. I'd never asked David for money. Ever. Even when my grandmother's final hospital bills had nearly bankrupted me, I'd worked overtime rather than burden him with my problems. I began, but William held up his hand again. December 15th, he read aloud. David had to cover Sarah's rent again because she spent her paycheck on those ridiculous art supplies. January 22nd, Sarah's car payment bounced and David had to transfer $500 to her account. He looked up at Patricia, who had gone completely white. Should I keep going? David stepped closer to his father. Dad, I've never given Sarah money for rent or car payments. And what art supplies? She doesn't even, he stopped mid-sentence, understanding dawning on his face. Mom, have you been going through my bank statements? The silence stretched so long I could hear the ice melting in people's water glasses. Patricia's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. I was concerned about your financial stability. As your mother, I have a right to. You've been monitoring my bank account? David's voice rose to a level I'd never heard before. For how long? Uncle Robert cleared his throat from table 12. Patricia, you told me last Christmas that Sarah had maxed out David's credit cards buying designer purses. He looked at me apologetically. You're carrying a $15 Target bag right now, aren't you? I nodded, suddenly understanding why half the family had seemed so cold to me at holiday gatherings. They hadn't been judging me for who I was, they'd been judging me for who Patricia had convinced them I was. David's cousin Jennifer stood up at table 4, her face flushed with what looked like guilt. Aunt Patricia told me Sarah had been pressuring David to buy her an engagement ring he couldn't afford. She said Sarah had picked out a 3-carat diamond and thrown a tantrum when David suggested something smaller. Jennifer looked at my left hand, where David's great-grandmother's simple gold band with its tiny vintage stone caught the light. But that's Grammy Rose's ring, isn't it? The one David always said he wanted to give to someone special because it was the only thing left of her? Sarah specifically asked for Grammy Rose's ring, David said quietly. She said she'd rather wear something with family history than have something expensive and meaningless. He turned to face his mother fully. Mom, what the hell have you been telling people? Patricia's carefully styled hair was beginning to come loose from its updo, small wisps framing her face as she looked around the room at expressions ranging from confusion to outright anger. Her own sister-in-law, Catherine, was shaking her head slowly. Patricia, you told me Sarah had quit her job and was living off David's salary, Catherine said. You said she was too lazy to work and spent her days shopping online. I work 50-hour weeks, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I made partner track last month. David's phone buzzed, and he glanced down at it automatically. His face went completely pale. Mom, he said, holding up his screen, why am I getting a fraud alert from my bank? Someone's been accessing my account from an unauthorized device. Patricia took a step backward, nearly tripping over her own chair. The device is registered to your laptop, David continued, reading from his phone. IP address traced to your house. It's been happening for. Jesus Christ, Mom, for over 2 years? The room erupted in whispers and shocked murmurs. Michelle was still recording, her phone moving between Patricia and David like she was documenting a tennis match. But it was David's grandmother Eleanor who delivered the final blow. In her wavering but determined voice, she called out across the room, Patricia, dear, would you like to explain to everyone why you hired a private investigator to follow Sarah last spring? The wedding coordinator dropped her clipboard. The sound that came out of Patricia's mouth wasn't quite a word, more like air escaping from a punctured tire. She stood there, swaying slightly in her champagne-colored dress, staring at her 94-year-old mother-in-law like Eleanor had just announced aliens were landing on the dance floor. A private investigator? David's voice cracked on the last word. He looked from his grandmother to his mother, then back again. Mom, tell me Grandma Eleanor is confused. Tell me you didn't. I was protecting you, Patricia whispered, but her voice carried in the absolute silence of the reception hall. You wouldn't listen to reason, so I had to find proof that she was. Proof of what? I interrupted, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Something had shifted inside me when Eleanor mentioned the investigator. The humiliation was crystallizing into something sharper, cleaner. Anger, maybe, but the useful kind. What exactly were you hoping to find? Patricia's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape route or an ally. She found neither. Even her own husband was staring at her like she'd grown a second head. The man's name is Douglas Chin, Eleanor continued, her oxygen tank hissing softly as she spoke. Patricia hired Chin Investigations in March. She showed me the file last month, thought I'd be interested in what he'd found. Eleanor's smile was sharp as broken glass. 3 months of surveillance, Patricia. Following that girl to work, to the grocery store, to her grandmother's grave. Do you want to tell everyone what your expensive investigation discovered? Mother Eleanor, please. Nothing. Eleanor's voice cut through Patricia's protests. $2,000 to confirm that Sarah goes to work, buys groceries, visits a cemetery, and occasionally meets her college friend Jessica for coffee on Sundays. She looked directly at me. Though I believe there was some excitement when you were photographed entering a medical building downtown. Patricia was convinced you were hiding a drug problem or a secret pregnancy. My face went hot. I was getting STD testing, I said loudly, past caring about privacy. Standard blood work before the wedding. My doctor required it for my insurance physical. But the investigator followed you to 3 different appointments, Patricia said desperately, like this somehow vindicated her actions. 3 times in 2 weeks. Because the first blood draw got contaminated and they had to redo it, I snapped. Then I had to come back for the results. Jesus Christ, Patricia, you could have just asked me. David was staring at his phone again, his face cycling through expressions I couldn't read. Mom, he said slowly, I have a text here from you, dated March 28th. You told me Sarah had been acting suspicious and disappearing at odd hours. You said you were worried she was having an affair. The whispers around the room grew louder. At table 8, my coworker Janet was shaking her head in disbelief. She'd been at those Sunday coffee dates Patricia's investigator had documented. We'd been planning my wedding shower. March 28th was when I started picking up extra weekend shifts, I said, pieces clicking together in my mind. We needed money for the wedding deposit. I was working Saturdays at the downtown office to help pay for, I gestured around the room, at the crystal chandeliers and silk draping and elaborate floral arrangements, all of this. You were working weekends to pay for your own wedding? This came from David's Aunt Catherine, Patricia's sister-in-law, who sounded horrified. Patricia, you told us David was going into debt for an extravagant party that Sarah insisted on. The wedding cost $18,000, David said, still scrolling through his phone. Sarah paid for $11,000 of it. I have the Venmo transactions right here. He looked up at his mother with something that might have been disgust. You knew that, Mom. You complained about Sarah throwing money around when she paid the caterer. Uncle Robert was pulling out his own phone now. Patricia, last month you started a group text with the whole family. Said we might need to stage an intervention because Sarah was financially abusing David. He held up his screen. You sent pie charts, Patricia. Actual pie charts showing how Sarah was supposedly draining his savings. I have screenshots, Michelle called out from table 6, still recording. Aunt Patricia sent them to my mom too. Said Sarah had David under her thumb and was isolating him from family. The wedding coordinator, Maria, was edging toward the exit like she was planning to flee. I didn't blame her. In 15 years of event planning, she'd probably never witnessed a public demolition quite this thorough. But David's grandmother Eleanor wasn't finished. Patricia, dear, would you also like to explain why you called Sarah's employer last week? Eleanor's voice carried the sweet venom of someone who'd been saving the best for last. Something about concerns regarding her character? My blood turned to ice water. You called Hendricks and Associates? Patricia's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked less like a society matron and more like a cornered animal. I was trying to protect David from making the biggest mistake of his life, she said, her voice breaking. Can't you see she's not right for our family? What did you tell them? I asked, my voice deadly quiet. Patricia, William's voice carried a warning I'd never heard before. What did you do? But I already knew. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity, why my boss Jennifer had seemed unusually concerned about my home situation lately, why the senior partner had postponed my review meeting twice, why I'd caught whispers in the break room that stopped when I entered. You told them I was unstable, I said. It wasn't a question. Patricia's silence was answer enough. The room felt like it was tilting. My legs went weak, and I gripped the back of David's chair to steady myself. What exactly did you tell my employer, Patricia? She looked around desperately, as if someone might rescue her from this moment. No one moved. I may have mentioned some concerns about your emotional stability, she whispered. And perhaps some questions about your professional judgment. Jesus fucking Christ, Mom. David's profanity cut through the room like a whip crack. I'd never heard him swear in front of his family before. Sarah's up for senior associate. That promotion could change our entire future. My boss Jennifer was already pulling out her phone at table 9, her expression grim. She'd driven 2 hours to be here, had seemed genuinely excited to celebrate with me. Now I understood why she'd been asking pointed questions about my stress levels and whether I was managing everything okay at home. Jennifer, I called across the room, my voice surprisingly steady. What did she tell you? Jennifer looked uncomfortable but answered honestly. Someone called claiming to be a concerned family member. Said you'd been having emotional outbursts, missing work for undisclosed reasons, and that your upcoming marriage might be affecting your judgment on cases. She paused, looking directly at Patricia. They also suggested you might have substance abuse issues that the firm should be aware of. The collective gasp from the room sounded like air being sucked from the space. Even Michelle stopped recording for a moment, her mouth hanging open. I've never missed work except for my grandmother's funeral, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the silence. My attendance record is perfect. And I've been sober since college except for the occasional glass of wine. The caller also mentioned financial irregularities, Jennifer continued reluctantly. Suggested you might be under pressure that could compromise your ethics. They specifically mentioned gambling debts. David's laugh was sharp and bitter. Gambling debts? Sarah's idea of a wild night is staying up past 10 to finish a crossword puzzle. Uncle Robert stood up slowly at table 12, his face flushed red. Patricia, that's enough. That's someone's livelihood you're tampering with. He looked around the room at his assembled family members. How many of us did you contact with your concerns about Sarah? Show of hands. More hands went up. David's cousin Michael at table 3. His Aunt Diane at table 11. Even Patricia's own mother, who raised a trembling hand from her wheelchair at the head table. You told Grandma Rose that Sarah was trying to steal Grammy's ring? David's voice cracked. She's 98 years old, Mom. She spent 2 months worried that her great-grandmother's ring was going to someone who didn't deserve it. Patricia's mother, Rose, spoke up in her paper-thin voice. Patricia showed me pictures from that investigator, dear. Said Sarah had been pawning jewelry to pay gambling debts. She looked at me with eyes full of tears. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have asked you directly. The room was spinning now, but in a strange way, I felt calmer than I had in years. The monster was finally out of the shadows, visible to everyone. Patricia had overplayed her hand so spectacularly that there was no going back, no room for gaslighting or manipulation. How long? I asked, looking directly at Patricia. How long have you been systematically trying to destroy my reputation with anyone who might matter to David or me? Patricia's champagne-colored dress was wrinkled now, her makeup smudged. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her exposed cruelty. I was protecting my son, she said weakly. From what? David demanded. From someone who loves him? From someone who makes him happy? Patricia straightened slightly, grasping for her last shred of justification. From making the same mistake I did. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Patricia's face went white as she realized what she'd just said, but it was too late. The confession was out there, witnessed by 150 people and Michelle's still recording phone. The same mistake you did? William's voice was so quiet it was barely audible, but somehow everyone heard it. Patricia, what mistake? David's father had gone completely still beside his wife, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the table. In 31 years of marriage, I'd never seen him look at Patricia the way he was looking at her now, like she was a stranger wearing his wife's face. William, I didn't mean, Patricia started, but David's grandmother Eleanor cut her off. She means marrying beneath her station, Eleanor said, her oxygen tank hissing as she leaned forward. Don't you, Patricia? You've spent 30 years regretting that you didn't hold out for someone with more money, more prestige. Someone who could have given you the life you thought you deserved. The silence was deafening. At table 7, my college roommate Jessica had her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. David's cousin Jennifer was staring at Patricia like she'd never seen her before. William stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. Is that true, Patricia? Is that what you really think about our marriage? No, of course not. Patricia reached for his arm, but he stepped away from her touch. William, you're taking this out of context. I just meant that David has opportunities one didn't have, choices. What choices? William's voice grew louder. The choice not to marry someone from a working-class family? The choice not to marry someone whose father was a mechanic instead of a doctor. My heart clenched. I'd never known that about David's father, had never thought to ask about his background. Patricia had always spoken about the family like they were old money, established society. Your father worked on cars, I said to David, suddenly understanding. That's why you know how to fix everything, why you spent all those Saturdays teaching me basic maintenance. David nodded, his eyes never leaving his mother's face. Grandpa Joe owned a garage in Cicero. Dad worked there summers through high school, put himself through community college on a basketball scholarship. His voice was tight with controlled fury. Mom, you spent my entire life acting like we came from money. You made me feel ashamed of Grandpa Joe's stories about growing up poor. Uncle Robert was shaking his head slowly. Patricia, your own father drove a city bus for 40 years. Your mother cleaned houses to help pay for your wedding. That was different, Patricia snapped, her composure finally cracking completely. I improved myself. I learned how to dress properly, how to speak properly, how to fit in. I didn't drag my family down by clinging to. To what? David's voice was dangerously quiet. To people who actually work for a living? To people who don't spend their days manufacturing drama and tearing down anyone who threatens their delusions of grandeur? Patricia's face went red, then white, then red again. David, you have no idea what I sacrificed to give you the opportunities you have. I remade myself completely so you could have a better life than I did. By lying about who we are? David gestured around the room. By pretending Dad's family doesn't exist? By making me think I was supposed to be ashamed of where I came from? William was pulling out his phone again, scrolling through what looked like recent calls. Patricia, I'm seeing calls here to Sarah's employer, to David's bank, to 3 different members of my family. He looked up at her with an expression I couldn't identify. There's also a call to Chicago Tribune. What did you tell the Tribune, Patricia? My stomach dropped. The Tribune? Why would she call a newspaper? I may have mentioned some concerns about professional ethics at a prominent law firm, Patricia whispered. Jennifer, my boss, stood up so abruptly her chair fell over. You called a newspaper about one of our associates? Patricia, that could destroy not just Sarah's career, but potentially damage our entire firm's reputation. What did you tell them exactly? I asked, my voice somehow steady despite the fact that my entire professional life was apparently hanging by a thread. Patricia looked around the room desperately, but found no allies, no escape routes. Even her own mother was staring at her with horror. I told them there might be a story about conflicts of interest at Hendricks and Associates, she said finally. About an associate who might be compromising cases due to personal financial pressures. The room erupted in angry voices, but all I could hear was the sound of my career potentially crumbling. For years of law school, 2 years of night classes, countless 60-hour weeks building my reputation, all of it threatened by a woman who couldn't stand the thought of her son being happy with someone she considered beneath him. But Jennifer surprised me. Instead of looking panicked, she looked furious. Ma'am, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos, I hope you have excellent legal representation. Because making false reports to journalists about a practicing attorney's ethics is defamation per se in Illinois. And given that you've apparently been conducting a sustained campaign of harassment across multiple venues, we're looking at potential criminal charges as well. Patricia's face went ashen. I was just concerned about my son's welfare. You hired a private investigator to stalk my employee, Jennifer continued relentlessly. You made false reports to her employer, her professional contacts, and now the press. That's not parental concern, Mrs. Patterson. That's criminal harassment. David's phone buzzed again. He glanced down, and his face went completely white. Mom, he said, his voice barely audible, the Tribune wants to interview me tomorrow morning. They're asking about Sarah's alleged gambling problem and whether it's affected her legal work. The champagne glass Patricia had been clutching slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor for the second time that evening. That's when my phone started buzzing. Then David's phone. Then Jennifer's phone, and Uncle Robert's phone, and what seemed like half the phones in the room all at once. David answered his first. Hello? Yes, this is David Patterson. His face went from pale to gray. I'm sorry, what? No, there's no gambling problem. Who told you? He looked at Patricia with pure horror. Ma'am, we're at our wedding reception right now. Can this possibly wait until? He hung up and immediately turned to me. Sarah, that was Channel 7 News. They want a statement about the developing story regarding financial irregularities at Hendricks and Associates. Jennifer was on her phone now, pacing behind table 9 with the controlled panic of someone watching their law firm's reputation go up in flames in real time. No, Tom, there are no irregularities. Someone made a false report. Yes, I'm absolutely certain. Because I'm literally watching the person who made the false report standing in front of me right now. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I answered it without thinking. Sarah Martinez? The voice was crisp, professional. This is Rebecca Chen from the Chicago Tribune. We're running a story tomorrow about potential ethics violations at Hendricks and Associates. We understand you've been gambling with client funds? I don't gamble, I said automatically. And I've never touched client funds. Who told you that? We received a tip from a concerned family member about your compromised professional judgment. Can you comment on your recent financial difficulties and how they might have affected your legal work? I looked across the room at Patricia, who was now sitting in her chair like it was an electric chair waiting for the switch to be thrown. The concerned family member, I said into the phone, is my mother-in-law, who has spent 2 years trying to destroy my relationship with her son. She hired a private investigator to stalk me and has been making false reports to anyone who would listen. Can you prove that? I looked at Michelle, who was still recording everything on her phone. Actually, yes. We have it all on video. David's cousin Michael stood up from table 3, his own phone pressed to his ear. Aunt Patricia, he called across the room, did you also call my workplace? Because I'm getting a very strange call from my HR department asking about my troubled family connections and whether they might affect my security clearance. Michael worked for the Department of Defense. A security clearance issue could destroy his career. Patricia's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around the room, more phones were buzzing. David's cousin Jennifer at table 4 was now on a call with someone asking about criminal associates in the family. Uncle Robert was fielding questions about his medical practice and whether he'd been aware of substance abuse issues among his relatives. Jesus Christ, Mom, David said, staring at his phone screen. How many people did you call? I've got missed calls here from 3 different reporters, David's bank, and something called Illinois State Bar Association Ethics Hotline. The State Bar Ethics Hotline. My professional license was potentially in jeopardy because my mother-in-law couldn't accept that her son had chosen someone from a working-class background. Jennifer finished her call and walked over to our table, her expression grim. Sarah, I need you to know that the firm is behind you completely. But we're going to need to do serious damage control. Patricia, she turned to address my mother-in-law directly, I hope you understand that your actions tonight may have legal consequences far beyond this family dispute. I was trying to protect my son, Patricia repeated weakly, but even she seemed to realize how hollow that sounded now. David's father William was scrolling through his own phone, his jaw clenched. Patricia, there's a message here from our insurance company. Apparently someone reported that we might be harboring a family member with substance abuse issues, and they're reviewing our homeowner's policy. And here's one from our country club, he continued, his voice growing harder with each word. Someone expressed concerns about our family's criminal associations and suggested they review our membership status. Patricia had created a web of lies so extensive that it was now collapsing back on her own family, destroying relationships and reputations indiscriminately. That's when David's grandmother Eleanor spoke up one final time. Patricia, dear, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned reception hall, I think it's time you left. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Patricia looked around the room desperately, her champagne-colored dress now wrinkled and stained with wine, her carefully styled hair falling loose around her shoulders. Mother Eleanor, surely we can discuss this privately, Patricia began, but Eleanor held up one trembling hand. There's nothing left to discuss privately, dear. You've made this entire situation quite public. Eleanor's oxygen tank hissed as she adjusted herself in her wheelchair. William, I believe your wife needs an escort to her car. But before William could respond, Patricia's phone started ringing. The sound cut through the tense silence like a fire alarm. She glanced down at the screen, and her face went from pale to green. That's Channel 9 News, she whispered, staring at her phone like it might explode. How did they get my number? David's cousin Michelle lowered her recording phone slightly. Aunt Patricia, when you called all those reporters, did you give them your contact information? The phone kept ringing. Patricia let it go to voicemail, but immediately it started ringing again. This time the caller ID showed Tribune Business Desk. Turn it off, William said quietly. I can't just. Turn off the phone, Patricia. She fumbled with the device, her manicured nails clicking against the screen. But as soon as she powered it down, David's phone started buzzing again. It's the Sun-Times, he said, looking at the caller ID. They want to know if I can confirm that my wife has been misappropriating client funds to cover gambling debts. He looked up at his mother with something that might have been hatred. Mom, what exactly did you tell these people? Patricia's voice was barely a whisper. I may have elaborated on some details to make them take the situation seriously. Elaborated how? Jennifer demanded from table 9, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke rapidly to what sounded like the firm's crisis management team. I told them Sarah had been skimming money from client settlements to pay off bookies in Chinatown, Patricia said, the words tumbling out like a confession. And that she'd been using David's identity to take out cash advances because her own credit was destroyed. The collective gasp from the room sounded like a hurricane making landfall. Even Michelle stopped recording again, her mouth hanging open in shock. Patricia, Uncle Robert said slowly, those are specific criminal allegations. You didn't just call in a tip, you filed false police reports. I never called the police. The State Bar Ethics Hotline is connected to law enforcement, Jennifer called out, still on her phone. When you report criminal activity by a practicing attorney, it automatically triggers an investigation by the Illinois State Police Financial Crimes Unit. My legs gave out completely. I sank into my wedding dress, the beaded fabric pulling around me like a fallen chandelier. David dropped to his knees beside me, his arms wrapping around my shoulders. Sarah, breathe, he whispered. We'll fix this. We'll fix all of this. But I was staring at Jennifer, who had gone completely rigid as she listened to whoever was on the other end of her call. After a moment, she hung up and walked over to us. Sarah, I need you to listen carefully. The firm's security office just got a call from Illinois State Police. They're requesting all your case files for the past 2 years for a fraud investigation. She glanced at Patricia with pure venom. Someone provided them with specific case numbers and dollar amounts. I don't understand, I managed to say through the ringing in my ears. How could she have case numbers? Those are confidential client files. Jennifer's expression grew even grimmer. That's what we need to find out. David was scrolling through his phone frantically. There's a news alert here. Chicago law firm under investigation for attorney fraud. They're using your name, Sarah. Your actual name is in the headline. The room started spinning again, but this time I couldn't stop it. The spinning stopped when my phone rang with a number I recognized, my grandmother's old attorney, Marcus Webb. He'd helped settle her estate 2 years ago, and I hadn't heard from him since. Sarah? His voice was tight with concern. I just got a very disturbing call from someone claiming to represent your family. They said there were questions about how you handled your grandmother's estate funds. My blood turned to ice. What questions? They suggested you might have diverted some of the proceeds for personal use instead of paying off her medical debts. Sarah, I need you to know that I defended your handling of everything. You were meticulous, honest to a fault. But they mentioned specific dollar amounts from the estate settlement. Information that should only be in sealed probate files. I looked across the room at Patricia, who was now slumped in her chair like a deflated balloon. Mr. Webb, what specific amounts did they mention? They knew about the $47,000 life insurance payout and the $23,000 from the house sale. They also knew you'd used $15,000 of your inheritance to pay for your grandmother's final hospitalization before insurance kicked in. His voice grew more concerned. Sarah, how would anyone outside the family know those exact figures? David was staring at his mother with an expression I'd never seen before. Mom, did you go through Sarah's financial records too? Not just mine? Patricia didn't answer, but her silence was deafening. That's when David's father William stood up with his phone in his hand, his face grave. I just got off a call with our bank. Someone requested detailed statements for all our family accounts, claiming to be investigating fraud connected to recent large cash transfers. He looked directly at his wife. Patricia, the request came from your email address. You told them you suspected our son and daughter-in-law were laundering money through our accounts. Money laundering? David's voice cracked. Mom, the only transfer was when I paid you back the $2,000 you loaned us for the wedding deposit. You have the cancel check. Uncle Robert was shaking his head slowly. Patricia, do you realize you potentially triggered federal banking investigations? Money laundering allegations automatically involve the FBI. The word FBI seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. Jennifer was back on her phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to someone at the law firm. Michelle had started recording again, her phone capturing Patricia's complete breakdown of composure. I have the estate settlement documents, I said, my voice gaining strength as the pieces clicked together. Mr. Webb, everything was legal and documented. Every penny was accounted for. I know that, Sarah. But the caller also mentioned something about gambling debts being paid from estate funds. They claimed you'd admitted to using your grandmother's life insurance money to cover casino losses in Indiana. David laughed bitterly. Sarah's never been to a casino. She thinks lottery tickets are a waste of money. The caller was very specific, Mr. Webb continued. They mentioned Blue Chip Casino in Michigan City, said you'd been there regularly and had borrowed against your inheritance to cover losses. Patricia finally spoke, her voice barely audible. I may have seen some credit card charges for Michigan City and assumed. What charges? David demanded. I closed my eyes, remembering. The Cancer Treatment Center. We drove to Michigan City every week for 3 months for your grandmother's experimental chemotherapy. I opened my eyes and stared directly at Patricia. You saw gas station receipts and medical bills from Michigan City and invented an entire gambling addiction. The silence that followed was broken only by Eleanor's oxygen tank hissing and the distant sound of phones buzzing throughout the room as more reporters, investigators, and concerned relatives tried to reach various family members. David's cousin Michael walked over to our table, his security clearance call apparently finished. Aunt Patricia, he said quietly, I need you to understand something. Federal investigators are now involved in this situation. What started as family drama has become a criminal matter involving multiple agencies and potentially dozens of innocent people. Patricia looked up at her nephew with tears streaming down her face, her elaborate makeup completely ruined. I just wanted David to see. See what? David asked, his voice completely flat now. That the woman I love was worth destroying? That our entire family was worth destroying just to prove some delusional point about social status? Patricia's only answer was the sound of her quiet sobbing, barely audible over the chaos of phones ringing and whispered conversations happening throughout our ruined wedding reception. That's when the reception hall doors opened and 2 people in dark suits walked in. The conversations died instantly as everyone turned to stare at the newcomers, a tall woman with graying hair and a younger man carrying what looked like a badge wallet. Excuse me, the woman said, her voice carrying easily across the silent room. We're looking for Patricia Patterson and Sarah Martinez. I'm Agent Lisa Hoffman, FBI Financial Crimes Division. The blood drained from my face. Beside me, David's grip on my hand tightened so hard I thought he might break my fingers. Patricia made a sound like a wounded animal. We received multiple reports today regarding potential money laundering, bank fraud, and organized gambling operations, Agent Hoffman continued, scanning the room. We'd like to speak with both of you regarding some serious allegations. Jennifer immediately stepped forward, her lawyer instincts kicking in. I'm Jennifer Martinez, Sarah's employer and legal counsel. What specific allegations are we discussing? The younger agent consulted his tablet. We have reports of approximately $70,000 in suspicious transfers between multiple accounts, alleged gambling debts exceeding $100,000, and possible client fund misappropriation at Hendricks and Associates. He looked directly at me. Ms. Martinez, we need to discuss your recent financial activities. There are no gambling debts, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. There's been a misunderstanding. The reports were very detailed, Agent Hoffman interrupted. Someone provided us with specific dates, locations, and dollar amounts. We have documentation of weekly trips to Michigan City, large cash withdrawals, and irregular payment patterns to what appear to be illegal bookmaking operations. David stood up slowly. The Michigan City trips were for cancer treatment. My grandmother-in-law was receiving chemotherapy at the University of Michigan Medical Center satellite facility there. Agent Hoffman's partner checked his tablet again. We have reports of Ms. Martinez being seen entering and leaving Blue Chip Casino multiple times per week for a 3-month period. The cancer center is in the same parking complex as the casino, I said, understanding dawning. The medical building shares parking with the hotel. Someone saw me there and assumed. Mrs. Patterson, Agent Hoffman turned toward Patricia. You filed the initial reports. Do you have evidence to support these allegations? Patricia looked around the room desperately, her champagne-colored dress now completely wrinkled, her makeup streaked with tears. I may have misinterpreted some information. Misinterpreted how? The younger agent asked, his pen poised over a notepad. I hired a private investigator, Patricia whispered. Douglas Chin. He provided surveillance photos and financial records, but I may have drawn incorrect conclusions about what they meant. Agent Hoffman exchanged a look with her partner. Ma'am, are you telling us that you filed false reports with federal agencies based on speculation? David's uncle Robert stepped forward, his face grim. Agents, I'm Dr. Robert Patterson, and I can verify that my mother-in-law, Rose Martinez, was indeed receiving experimental cancer treatment in Michigan City. I helped coordinate her care with the oncology team there. We'll need documentation of that treatment, Agent Hoffman said, making notes. Ma'am, she turned back to Patricia, filing false reports with federal agencies is a felony. We'll need you to come with us for questioning. The wedding coordinator, Maria, had been standing frozen near the DJ booth throughout this entire disaster, but now she approached our table with obvious reluctance. Folks? The venue has a policy about law enforcement activities. We're going to need to end the reception, David finished flatly. I understand. Agent Hoffman was still taking notes. Mrs. Patterson, we also need to discuss the reports you made to multiple news outlets. Deliberately spreading false information to damage someone's reputation while simultaneously filing false federal reports suggests a coordinated campaign of harassment. Patricia's sobs grew louder, but I found myself feeling strangely calm. The monster was finally being caged by people with actual authority to stop her. Agent Hoffman, I said quietly, I have complete financial records, medical documentation, and legal files that can verify everything. My employer can provide character references and case history. Jennifer nodded firmly. We'll cooperate fully with your investigation, agents. And we'll be filing our own complaint against Mrs. Patterson for defamation and interference with business relationships. Patricia looked up at the agents with mascara-streaked cheeks. I just wanted to protect my son, she whispered one final time. Agent Hoffman's expression didn't soften. Ma'am, you'll need to come with us now. The moment Agent Hoffman finished speaking, Patricia's husband William did something I'd never seen in the 3 years I'd known him. He stepped away from his wife completely. Agent Hoffman, he said, his voice carrying across the silent reception hall, I need you to know that I had no knowledge of my wife's actions. None of us did. He gestured around the room at his assembled family members. She's been conducting this campaign entirely on her own. Dad, David said quietly, but William held up his hand. No, son. This has gone too far. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what looked like months of text messages. Agent Hoffman, I have documentation here showing that Patricia has been lying to me as well. She told me Sarah had asked to borrow money for gambling debts. She showed me what she claimed were bank statements proving it. The younger agent looked up from his notepad. Do you still have those alleged bank statements? William nodded grimly. They're in my home office. I should have questioned them more carefully, but I trusted my wife. He looked at Patricia with something that might have been disgust. Apparently that was a mistake. Agent Hoffman was making more notes when her phone buzzed. She answered it quickly, stepping a few feet away from our table. I could only catch fragments of her conversation. Yes, we're here now. Multiple complainants. Appears to be fabricated. When she returned, her expression was even more serious. Mrs. Patterson, I just spoke with Douglas Chin, the private investigator you hired. He's very concerned about how you've been using his surveillance reports. Patricia's face went completely white. What did he tell you? Mr. Chin says he specifically told you that Ms. Martinez's trips to Michigan City appeared to be medical-related, not casino visits. He documented her entering the medical building, not the casino. He also told you there was no evidence of gambling activity whatsoever. Agent Hoffman's voice grew harder. He says you insisted he was wrong and demanded he keep looking for evidence of illegal activity that didn't exist. David's grandmother Eleanor spoke up from her wheelchair, her voice carrying despite its frailness. Agent, I have the investigator's actual report in my purse. Patricia showed it to me last month, thinking I'd be interested. She fumbled with her handbag. The report clearly states that Sarah appeared to be visiting someone receiving medical treatment. Jennifer walked over and gently took the folder from Eleanor's trembling hands, then brought it to Agent Hoffman. Douglas Chin Investigation Services, she read aloud. Subject observed entering University of Michigan Medical Center satellite facility. Subject observed assisting elderly woman with mobility issues. No evidence of gambling activity observed. Recommend terminating surveillance as subject appears to be engaged in legitimate caregiving activities. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia had not only ignored her own investigator's conclusions, she deliberately misrepresented them to everyone, including federal agents. Agent Hoffman's partner was now taking detailed notes. Mrs. Patterson, you received a report stating there was no evidence of gambling, and you chose to file federal complaints alleging extensive gambling activities anyway? Patricia's voice was barely a whisper. I thought he missed something. I thought if I could just get someone to look deeper. You thought wrong, Agent Hoffman said curtly. She turned to me with what might have been sympathy. Ms. Martinez, we'll need you to come in tomorrow morning to provide documentation, but based on what we're seeing here, it appears you're the victim of a coordinated harassment campaign rather than a perpetrator of financial crimes. My phone buzzed with another unknown number. This time, I handed it directly to Jennifer without answering. Channel 5 News, she said after checking the caller ID. Sarah, we need to get ahead of this media situation immediately. David was staring at his mother like he'd never seen her before. Mom, do you understand what you've done? Sarah could have been arrested. She could have lost her law license, her career, everything. His voice broke slightly. And for what? Because you can't accept that I'm happy? Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but Agent Hoffman cut her off. Ma'am, we need to continue this conversation at our field office. You have the right to remain silent. The Miranda warning seemed to echo endlessly in the crystal chandelier reception hall as Agent Hoffman continued reading Patricia her rights. But before she could finish, David's cousin Michelle stepped forward with her phone still recording. Agent Hoffman, I've been filming this entire reception. I have Patricia on video admitting to filing false reports, hiring the private investigator, and calling Sarah's employer with fabricated stories. She held up her phone. Would this be helpful for your investigation? Very helpful, the younger agent said, pulling out a business card. We'll need a copy of that footage. Patricia's face crumpled as the reality of her situation finally seemed to sink in. But William wasn't finished. Agent Hoffman, there's something else you need to know. He was scrolling through his phone with the determination of a man who'd finally seen enough. Patricia has been intercepting Sarah and David's mail for 6 months. I found credit card statements and bank notifications in our house that were addressed to their apartment. My heart stopped. What did you just say? William's voice was steady but filled with disgust. I found them last week when I was looking for tax documents in Patricia's desk. Bank statements from your account, Sarah, and credit monitoring reports addressed to both of you. All opened, all filed in a folder labeled David's Financial Security. Agent Hoffman and her partner exchanged meaningful looks. Mail theft is a federal crime, she said quietly. Mrs. Patterson, this adds mail fraud to the charges we're discussing. David was on his feet, his face flushed with rage. Mom, you've been stealing our mail? For 6 months? I was monitoring your finances to make sure she wasn't taking advantage of you, Patricia said desperately. A mother has a right to protect her son. A mother doesn't have the right to commit federal crimes, Agent Hoffman interrupted sharply. How did you access their mailbox? William answered before Patricia could speak. She had copies of their keys made 6 months ago. Told me she needed them in case of emergencies. His voice broke slightly. I gave her our spare set when they asked us to water their plants during their weekend trip to Milwaukee. The younger agent was writing frantically now. So we have mail theft, identity monitoring without consent, potential bank fraud. He looked up at Patricia. Ma'am, did you use the financial information from the stolen mail to file your reports with federal agencies? Patricia's silence was answer enough. That's when my phone rang again, this time with a number I recognized. My paralegal, Marcus, from the law firm. Sarah, thank God. The FBI just left our office with boxes of your case files, his voice was tight with stress. But they also said something weird. They had copies of your personal bank statements that someone had provided as evidence. Sarah, how would anyone outside your family have your banking information? I looked across the room at Patricia, who was now completely broken, mascara streaking down her cheeks as federal agents prepared to arrest her at my own wedding reception. Marcus, I think I know exactly how someone got my bank statements. Agent Hoffman overheard and stepped closer. Ms. Martinez, we're going to need to expand our investigation. If Mrs. Patterson has been systematically stealing financial documents and using them to file false federal reports, we're looking at a much larger conspiracy charge. David's hand found mine as we watched his mother finally face the consequences of her year-long campaign of destruction. But as the agents began to escort Patricia toward the door, she turned back one final time. David, please. I did all of this because I love you. David's response was quiet but devastating. No, Mom. You did this because you hate yourself. The handcuffs clicked shut around Patricia's wrists with a sound like a period at the end of a very long, very ugly sentence. As Agent Hoffman escorted my mother-in-law through the reception hall doors, the silence that followed felt different from all the tense quiet moments that had come before. This wasn't the breathless anticipation of waiting for the next revelation, this was the hollow echo of a storm finally passing. David sank into his chair beside me, his dress shirt wrinkled and his boutonniere hanging sideways. Sarah, I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice hoarse from 3 hours of revelations that had torn his family apart. I had no idea she was capable of. I know, I said quietly, watching through the crystal-paned windows as Patricia was helped into the back of an unmarked FBI vehicle. Nobody did. Jennifer appeared at my elbow with her phone pressed to her ear, speaking rapidly to someone at the firm. Yes, Tom, the FBI confirmed the reports were fabricated. No, Sarah's not under investigation anymore, the complainant has been arrested. We'll have a statement ready by morning. She hung up and turned to me with something that might have been a smile. The senior partners want to see you Monday morning, Sarah. Not for disciplinary reasons, they want to discuss your promotion. Apparently, handling a federal investigation with this much grace while wearing a wedding dress is exactly the kind of composure they look for in senior associates. David's cousin Michelle was still holding her phone. The recording finally stopped after 3 hours of the most comprehensive documentation of family dysfunction in Illinois history. Aunt Patricia's going to be internet famous, she said quietly. But probably not the way she always wanted to be. Uncle Robert walked over to our table, his face grave but relieved. David, Sarah, I owe you both an apology. We all do. Patricia's been poisoning our opinion of you for years, and we should have seen through it. Around the room, other family members were approaching with similar sentiments. David's cousin Jennifer, his Aunt Catherine, even his grandfather's brother Frank, who'd driven down from Wisconsin and witnessed his grandniece get arrested at what should have been a celebration. But it was David's grandmother Eleanor who had the final word. Sarah, dear, come here please, she called from her wheelchair at the head table. I walked over, my wedding dress rustling against the marble floor. Eleanor reached up with trembling hands and took mine. 67 years ago, I married David's grandfather in a dress that cost $12 and shoes I borrowed from my sister, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. His mother told everyone who would listen that I was after the family money, even though we were all poor as church mice back then. She squeezed my hands gently. Some women never learn that love isn't about what you can control, it's about what you're brave enough to let grow. She smiled up at me with eyes that had seen nearly a century of family drama. You're brave, Sarah. And you're kind. And you make my great-grandson happy. She glanced toward the windows where the FBI car was pulling away. Patricia never understood that happiness isn't something you have to earn or deserve, it's something you recognize when you find it. David appeared beside me, sliding his arm around my waist. Grandma Eleanor, we should probably call it a night. This wasn't exactly the wedding reception we planned. Eleanor chuckled, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Honey, in my experience, the best marriages start with the worst weddings. At least you'll never have a boring anniversary story. As the remaining guests began gathering their things and saying their goodbyes, Jennifer approached us one final time. Sarah, the Tribune wants to run a retraction and apology. The other news outlets will follow suit. By tomorrow morning, the only story will be about Patricia's arrest, not the false allegations. David's father William appeared at our table, looking older than he had that morning but somehow lighter too. Son, I've already spoken with a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow. And Sarah, he turned to me with tears in his eyes, I hope someday you can forgive us for not protecting you from her sooner. As we finally walked out of the reception hall at midnight, David and I still in our wedding clothes but holding hands like survivors of a natural disaster, I realized something strange. I wasn't angry anymore. Patricia had spent 2 years trying to prove I wasn't good enough for her son. Instead, she'd proven something else entirely, that David and I were strong enough to survive anything, even her. So, David said as we reached our car, how do you feel about eloping to Vegas for our first anniversary? Just us, an Elvis impersonator, and absolutely zero family members? I kissed my husband in the parking lot of the venue where his mother had just been arrested by federal agents, and laughed until I cried. David, after tonight, Vegas sounds perfectly normal.